Welcome to the first episode of Beyond Determined from Pacific Health. I'm Brian Lash.
I'm Yogin Shroff. And Brian, I know we have a fun topic today. What do we have in store?
Yogin, you're right. We've got a great one. Today we're going to talk about digital engagement in healthcare. With respect to our agenda, we've got a few items in store. Number one, we're going to talk about what is digital engagement. We'll chat about the challenges facing some organizations, and when we look at the landscape, why isn't everyone digitally mature? We'll talk about text as one of many digital media and how that plays into the modern healthcare ecosystem. And then finally, we'll have a conversation about where do we see this going next. So pretty packed agenda. We're going to keep it tight for folks. Leading off with number one, Yogin, what do people mean when they talk about healthcare digital engagement? Yeah,
digital engagement is it's an interesting topic, right? It's a little buzzwordy in the healthcare world today and really all walks of industries. But when I kind of think of digital engagement, to me, it really means how we're harnessing all these strong digital channels, whether it be SMS, text, email, so have you, and communicating with people and meeting them where they are to really build some of those more personalized relationships, right? And to my mind, I think it's important to really divorce the idea of digital engagement in the more traditional route in other industries and digital engagement in terms of what it means in healthcare. And what I really mean by that is when we think of digital engagement strategies in healthcare, it's not just the idea of communicating with folks, it's how are we communicating with them to help improve their lives, right? It's the why behind the digital engagement. I think that makes it so profound and impactful in the healthcare industry specifically.
Makes a lot of sense. So with that said, Yogin, I think most folks, especially after hearing that definition, most folks are going to agree digital engagement is a good thing. It's good for business. We know this. It's good for members and it's good for patients. So why isn't everybody digitally mature? What are the challenges there?
Yeah, it's $1 million question, right, Brian? I think there's a couple things, right? And Brian, I'll just say this because I know you and I have been in the healthcare industry long enough now. We've seen different challenges, pain points, and it's still really interesting to me, right? When we talk about starting with data first and foremost, it's still astounding to me that there are healthcare organizations out there that still are not mature enough to be able to track things like email addresses, even their patient or member phone numbers, right? So when we talk about adopting those digital engagement strategies, it's hard to do that without that critical level of information. So first and foremost, it's that. What's the data readiness? Do we have the data in-house? Turns out, surprisingly, there are organizations that don't, right? Second, and maybe a little bit more important to that, is the interoperability or the integration, right? And we've seen through all walks of life, it's how do we make sure that what we're actually sending out to patients or members is getting sent back to us? And then more important to that, how do we translate those data feeds so that they do turn into some level of what we'll air quote clinical records in our system, right? And that always seems to be a big challenge, and not to mention the maintenance and upkeep of a single system of record. Now, hopefully, majority of the audience here, we have EMRs and EHR systems now that help really kind of streamline a lot of those sort of challenges and pain points. But we also know that not every healthcare organization has that luxury of having EHRs, right? And then thirdly here is also cybersecurity, right? We're living in a virtual space. We're still kind of in COVID, and we've seen through that whole environment, everyone's gotten a little bit comfortable with the virtual environment, and folks that are looking to make some quick bucks too online, right? And in healthcare, as you know, Brian, we're dealing with PHI and PII and HIPAA data all the time. So, how do we make sure that there's some level of sophistication and security behind that level of information? And the good thing is there's vendors out there right now that have very sophisticated agreements in place. They have privacy policies in place that kind of give you a little bit of consolation. But at the end of the day, this is one of the many things that drives compliance officers, right, up a wall and keeps them up at night.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. It's probably a good transition point to talk about, off the top, Yogin, you mentioned SMS and chat, certainly mobile. There are all these different media, and at least in our business, we spend a lot of time thinking about text as a form of engagement. So where does text kind of fit into the grander scheme? How does that come to the fold?
Yeah, it's a great question too, Brian. I mean, text messaging, I think to me is kind of reigns supreme, right? When we talk about the digital channels and the ways to communicate with patients and members, and it doesn't take much research to find the open rate of text messages, Brian, is 99%, right? So when we're talking about being able to deliver some level of information to somebody that we consider to be important, the chances of them at least opening it up, forget the action part, but the fact that they're even opening it up already got us at least one step to the door, right? That's the biggest thing. But what's more important is, there's a journal, Brian, actually, I just stumbled across this a couple of weeks ago as I was kind of doing some light reading. There's a journal from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, and they actually did a really sophisticated study on exactly this topic, member engagement, digital engagement. And they actually found that about 86% of members actually prefer text messages over things like cold calls, emails, having to pull messages down from the portal themselves. Over 90% of them actually felt even more connected to their care team by communicating with them through text message, right? So those are just some relative examples of how text messaging is sort of taking over this whole digital landscape. And we're talking about digitizing our strategies. It's really interesting to see how far that element has really come even from a decade past.
Sure it is. And it's funny, Yogin, the metric that you just shared, 90%, did you say, of individuals prefer dealing with a care team over text?
It was about like 96%. It was a really high number.
So unexpected, at least from where I'm standing, because you think about healthcare and you think about a very personal kind of experience, and you imagine folks kind of seeking a relationship, whether it's with their PCP or other individuals in their care team. This is where the data is so valuable, because the data, you're right, the data tells a different story, that folks want to talk over text, and that's what we're seeing. So incidentally, Yogin, that's the backdrop. Where are we going? What's coming next with respect to digital engagement? And I ask this again against the backdrop of, the advent of the artificial intelligence era and chat GPT and chatbots more generally. So what comes next, and how can people be prepared?
Yeah, well, Brian, first of all, have you had a chance to play around a little bit with Chat GPT, OpenAI? It's pretty interesting, huh?
It had some pretty great ideas for this podcast. We'll see if we actually go live with any of them, but yeah, I think
we could probably talk quite a while about some of that. Sure. But no, it's really interesting, right? When we talk about kind of how Chat GPT in the more traditional sense, right, where the normal Joe Schmo is able to go on and get some really concise answers. And then when you sort of think about how do we transition that to the healthcare world, and I think you kind of answered in many ways, Brian, your own question, where is the direction of text messaging and digital channels really going? And it's hard not to think that it's really just going to follow that evolutionary path of artificial intelligence, everything we consider natural language processing, right? In terms of creating those really personalized, custom fit conversations, right? And you can kind of imagine yourself, you're a healthcare leader right now in a space, and you want to get in touch with Brian Lash, who's a patient or a member that's within your population. There are certain behavioral traits you could kind of start to gauge. How is Brian responding to certain things? How is he not responding to different things? And you could start to sort of see how that intelligence kind of plays into the factor of configuring how we as a healthcare organization are communicating with our members to get or motivate the best type of response from our patients and constituents, right? So those types of conversations really parlay, and we see the opportunity there is pretty immense. But at the surface here, Brian, I'd be really remiss. Really briefly, Tanati also mentioned the whole digital equity divide. It's hard to kind of go through the conversations of what these digital channels look like in the future without talking about the folks that don't have equal access to this type of technology. And just to kind of personalize, I know, Brian, you and I are from the beautiful grand state of Pennsylvania, and I know both of you and I have taken some journeys to the northern side of Pennsylvania, where it's a little bit more rural, a little bit more fragmented. And it's startling to see, how many individuals live in those spaces. And PA is just one example. How many folks live in those spaces where they don't have the proper infrastructure to receive text messages, receive emails.
Things that we take for granted.
Absolutely, 125%. So it's interesting, right? And that's kind of where the altruistic and the empathy element of being a healthcare leader or being in an organization where you're responsible for these types of individuals really kind of parlays a little bit more, and an opportunity to look for something a little bit more innovative in this space.
So, Yogin, we've talked at this point a lot about healthcare and digital engagement. How do we make this actionable for folks? So somebody who has listened to this, bottom line it for us. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, so I won't recap too much or go too much into detail here, Brian, but I'll kind of just resurface a little bit of what we said. So to me, when it comes to taking what we've talked about here in the past however many minutes, what do we take back from this? What are the tactical items that we can take back? I think first and foremost, it's what's your why behind digital engagement, right? So are you just a player, a healthcare player in this ecosystem that's adopting this digital strategy or digital channels just because your competitor's doing it? Are you doing it because it's just a trend? You might have some reasons why you would or why you wouldn't, but you got to find your why. What's your use case behind adopting the right type of digital engagement for your members, for your patients, right? And once you kind of have that applied and in place, we talked a little bit about the data, right? To be a little bit more boots on the ground here, right? We need to have the right type of data to make sure this is actionable. And we talked a little bit about the examples of organizations that maybe aren't always quite mature or always quite there. And then third on the list here, once you cross off box 1 and box 2, the third thing is, in my mind, is really around organizational readiness. And really what I mean by that is doing a true assessment of ourselves as an organization, right? Do we have the right team in place to build a digital engagement platform or a strategy? Or does it make more sense to partner up with vendors that are already doing great work in this space and also at the same time allows us to do the great work we're already doing, right? So there's some strategic decisions that need to be made. And Brian, I know you, just like me, come from that program mindset where there's no project or strategy that's complete without KPIs and metrics, right? And what's that phrase you use, Brian? The question that you usually ask about if the organization's actually succeeding. There's a
how do we know if we're winning?
That's it. That's the one.
What gets measured gets managed.
That's the one. I love that.
Famous Drucker quote. Yeah.
I love it. I feel like I've used that before too. I think it's a great one. So how do we actually track our progress against the baseline, right? That's the biggest thing. And the very last thing I'll kind of say here is it's okay to not be perfect. One of the things Brian and I always preach within our own company here is incremental progress, right? Consistency beats perfection every day of the week. So in that same vein, what does that incremental progress look like for a new digital strategy? And then finally, Brian, I think it's really all about being okay with not having a full-scale rollout on day one, right? And I know you and I within our own company, we preach this all the time where progress beats perfection, right? So what does incremental progress in this particular space really look like where it comes to adopting a new digital strategy? And the first thing that really pops to mind is being okay with doing a pilot, right? This is an opportunity to roll your product out or your strategy out to a small subset of members and patients and learning new things, right? Are they amenable to getting this new digital engagement, thrown their way? Or, are they giving you some level of feedback that might help you upgrade your product when you're ready for a full-scale implementation, right? So there's all sorts of learning lessons that can be taken out of doing things in bits and pieces.
That's awesome. Sounds great, Yogin. That's going to do it, I think, for today's podcast. Stay tuned, those in the audience, for next week, where we explore artificial intelligence in healthcare.
Oh, that's going to be a
great one around the bend. You're not going to want to miss it. To my co-host, Yogin, always a pleasure, my friend.
Always fun, Brian. Really appreciate the time. This was fun.
And to those of you in the audience, we're going to catch you next time on Beyond.